naming something gives you power over it. This is a fundamental truth of ritual magic, where it's based on the Bible. And it's also true in applied mathematics. In applied mathematics, if you want to apply mathematics to the real world, you start out by building an abstraction, creating a model, describing the problem you're trying to solve in full enough detail that you can approach it. In short, you find a way to name it. Today, I want to talk to you about that process, about how by naming something accurately and precisely, we gain power over it. We gain the ability to use mathematical techniques to learn more about the thing that we have named. So let's talk about neckties. I've always wanted to wear, what do you do now? Shirts, jackets, neckties. But it took until my 20s before I could find shirts that were fitted enough that I would be comfortable wearing them. Once I could find these shirts, once I started finding ways to dress comfortably and elegantly, I started wearing this combination quite a lot. And as a decoration of choice, I ended up picking out bow ties, self-tied bow ties, the ones where you stand around and fiddle with them, absolutely not the pre-tied ones. They are an abomination and should not come anywhere close, at least my neck. If you want to wear them, that's fine, but nowhere near my neck. And after a few years of wearing bow ties and accumulating a large enough collection of self-tied bow ties that I'm almost embarrassed that I have them, my wife showed me a YouTube clip with a description of how to tie a particular new kind of tie knot, the Trinity. And those of you sitting up front might see it's a Trinity that I'm wearing today. And so I learned how to tie this. It was love at first sight. I became obsessed with it. And soon after, I found a companion knot, another knot, from the same general source, the Eldridge. And I loved it at least as much. And I spent several months at this point obsessively wearing these, more or less alternatingly. And after a while of doing that, I do what I always do when I find a new interest. I geek out. I dive really, really, really deep into it, and I start learning everything there is to know. And in particular, I remember that there's been research done in mathematics on neckties before. A pair of Cambridge physicists, Thomas Fink and Yong Mao, studied neckties right around the turn of the millennium. They tried to figure out what are the possible neckties, what kind of neckties knot can we even tie. They wanted to list them, they wanted to count them. They found 85. And this was part of Thomas Fink's PhD thesis. And after nailing down the details in his thesis, they published the results in Nature, then gave more details in the physics journal Physica A, and finally dropped a popular science book talking about neckties in general and about how many tie knots there were, what their aesthetic characteristics are, and how to compute both the aesthetics and the amount of neckties available. So knowing these new knots that I was so enamored with, and knowing that there had been an attempt to list all possible necktie knots, I couldn't help but ask pretty much immediately, so do these knots occur? I really, really like wearing the Trinity and the Eldridge, and we have a comprehensive list of all tie knots. Are they in there? No. I looked looked up the articles, I read both the articles, they're not in the list. So I read the articles some more, I made sure that I could understand the details of how exactly they prove that there are 85 possible tie knots. And I discovered pretty quickly that there's no really good reason why they shouldn't be in there. So if you want to do any sort of research, one of the first things you need to do is to carve down the problem. Pretty much every single question you can think of, everything you can ask, is so big, there's no hope of finding a proper answer. So when you do research, you take your question and you carve it down. You try to specialize it, try to figure out just the one tiny bit of this question that you think you might be able to approach. And that's too big. So you carve it down even more, and you keep on carving down, you keep on splitting up into sub-problems until you find a small enough problem that you can actually solve it. And that's what Fink and Mao had done with neckties. So they had defined a necktie to be what, at that time, all neckties were. Something with a flat front. Something like, say, the half Windsor up there. Sorry, full Windsor up there. So the typical necktie, you would wind around, you would eventually go across, and you would go up, and you would sort of push it down, and you would stretch it, and you would have this nice flat front to the knot. And so they took as one of the conditions of what it means to be a name for a necktie knot, that it should have this flat front in the end. And so clearly these nice novel knots, they are by design not counted by the Cambridge physicists. And when you start looking at the history of things, what came before what, it's not even that surprising. These new necktie knots, they come out of an internet subculture. In 2003, 2 years after Fink and Mao published their book, the movie Matrix Reloaded showed up. And in Matrix Reloaded, our great heroes of simulated fights against robots meet up with a sort of rogue program, the Merovingian, who plays a role in the plot at that point. I can't quite remember the plot, but the key here is that there is this character, the Merovingian, and he wears slightly weird tie knots, just enough so that you look twice when he shows up on screen. There's something odd about him. And so people who saw this movie and were enthusiastic about the Merovingian started trying to figure out how to tie that knot. And they started trading recipes on the internet and building descriptions, started filming YouTube videos and traded back and forth. And they kinda, sorta, almost figured it out by now. But along the way, they created a whole bunch of both ideas for how to think about and how to create necktie knots, but also a whole bunch of new necktie knots that were admittedly not the Merovingian knot, but they were nevertheless both beautiful and completely novel in that they don't have the flat front. They have something more interesting. They have a texture to the front that conveys the elegance. So all of this happened after the Cambridge researchers had done their list. So of course, when they were doing the research, the whole idea of doing this didn't exist. But now it does, and it doesn't seem like it should be absent from the list. So I decided, because I do research into mathematics, and everything here touched on things that I already know at least a little bit about, so how hard could it be? I dove in and tried to figure out how to count these new knots as well. Turns out every time you ask how hard could it be, you have reason to regret it. I spent a bit over a year on this before I got anywhere. But in order to capture these new knots, we modified their techniques. And then we pulled in new and more powerful mathematical techniques than what they had been using. And we published it after we spent that year working on it and another year trying to get anyone to publish our research, and we found more knots than the 85. This is not very surprising. I'm wearing one knot that wasn't among the 85, so there are at least 86. Well, I know the Eldridge, so there are at least 87. But it turns out there's almost a bit over 250,000. There are 266,682 possible tie knots that might reasonably be tied with a usual necktie that you could find in the shop, assuming that you're reasonably normal-sized male, and, well, there are more and more features that go into it. And it turns out that this full spread of 250,000 neckties, they require you to be a bit fiddly about it. They might have particularly difficult steps along the way. So we could simplify it to something that's easy to explain, easy to teach someone how to do, and then we carve it down to way, way fewer neckties than the 250,000. In fact, of this easier type, there are 24,882. So we had this list, we had these counts, we knew how to create it, we had extended the methods by Fink and Mao to handle these many, many more ties. So the obvious first thing to do is to build a tie. So we have a website that will spit out a random tie at you, random tie knot at you, complete with a graphic description on what you need to do in order to tie it. And this website works because it has access to the names of the necktie knots, just in the same way as knowing how to name the knots helps us count them in the first place. So I figured for today, now that I have the attention of all of you, we'll take a look at how to name these knots. I want to teach you how to read a tie knot name and how to translate the name of the knot into an actual tie knot. And the name is simple enough that, and contains enough of the structure of the knot itself that you could use it to talk about knots. You could use it to communicate knots. You could, once you and whoever you're talking to know the rudiments of this naming system, you could explain a tie knot without seeing them, without touching their necktie. You could tell someone how to tie a necktie over the phone, help out a friend or a family member. So how do we name tie knots? Well, first off, we need to be able to name parts of the tie. I need to be able to talk about the tie itself. So a tie has a front, usually somewhat pretty, that's where the designers put all their energy. It has a back, usually not quite as pretty. There's a seam going down it. There tends to be a tie holder and labels and all sorts of fiddly bits. And it has two ends to it. I tend to call these blades because I need a name for them. And so normal modern ties have a wide blade and a narrow blade. And one thing we really, really want from a necktie knot is to be able to adjust it. I want to be able to take it off. And when I tie it, I want to be able to adjust it so that it sits nicely without choking me, but still sits pretty high up and in a place where it holds together the shirt and makes for an overall elegant and nice display. So we need for it to slide. And it turns out that for a knot to be able to slide, we need for one of the blades to stay straight and for the other blade to do all the tying. Because if this blade gets a kink, then the knot gets stuck at that kink. So let's call the straight blade the passive blade, and the one that we use to tie the active blade. Now, having this stationary passive blade helps us divide up the world. So we create three regions. There's a left region, there's a right region, and a center region. And a tie knot, it turns out, is almost completely described by the sequence of regions that the active blade goes through. And you wind it to the left, and then to the right, and then up in the center. And also you need to know that at some points you push the tie through itself to lock it in place. So I figured we'd look at the four-in-hand, which is probably the one anyone who knows to tie a tie knows how to tie. So we start by going left. Then after left, we go behind the tie to the right. And then in front of the tie again to the left. Then up through the center. And then finally, we push the active blade through the tie itself. We push it under a bow across the tie to lock it in place. Tighten it up, straighten it up, push it up so that it sits nice and snug, and you're done tying the tie. And this sequence of calling out the regions, and possibly also the added information of just how you cross over in the beginning, completely determines the tie knot. You can't do much different at that point. You could maybe put it a bit higher, a bit lower. You could stretch it more or less. But the essence of the knot is captured by this sequence of letters. And these letters still have to follow some rules. Not any string is a valid tie knot. There are things that are names, and importantly, there are things that are not names. Names of knot and not names of knot. And so you go through these moves. Sometimes you go in front, sometimes you go in the back, but you always go to a different place. You never quite stay in the same place. So when you've gone to the left, you need to go to the center or to the right. And you alternate. When you've been in front of the knot, you need to be in the back of the knot for the next step. And then every so often you need to go under a bow, but then there has to be a bow for you to go under, and it has to be placed in the right position, and that gives you constraints on how the letters can be arranged, what the name can look like. And then once you have all these constraints, you have a valid string, you just follow the instructions in the string and you end up with a tie knot. For these novel tie knots, you often end up with you tie them with a narrow end as a blade as the active blade, and you tend to end up going up into a direction. So you have a little bit that sort of, let's see if I have mine here. You have a tiny bit that sort of hangs out. And the idea then is to just hide it under the collar to make the knot look presentable. So we have a bunch of rules. Here are some of them. There are some more you can figure out. The size of the list of rules depends on how picky I want to be when I try to write them down. Once we have these rules, we can translate them into a formal system, a way of formally, abstractly describing the rules of this grammar, the rules of how to create a name of a tie knot. And once we have these formal, mechanic, computer-adapted rules, we can translate those into a system of equations. And as I said, I'm a mathematician. I know what to do with systems of equations. I can solve them. So we solve for tie, and we get this thing that's power series, which is sort of like a polynomial, where the important thing is that it's a bunch of numbers. And the numbers in this form stand for how many knots are there of this particular length, but we want all the knots, so we apply a particular algebraic operation that we know sums it up so that we get numbers that represents all the knots up to this length. And here, when we read for 13 moves, we get 24,882. And all this we get, all this we can do because we have a way of naming each knot systematically and accurately. Tie knots form just one example of all of this. I picked it because I've worked with it and because I think it's kind of fun to talk about neckties and tie knots. But it's just one example of where accurately naming something gives you power over it, even mathematically. And there are many, many more examples to be had. Suddenly, each and every one of you do some naming, systematizing, organization, both at home and at work. Just as Adam was given the task of naming in Genesis, and just like Linnaeus toiled away at a seemingly God-given task of systematization, the naming of things comes natural to humans. And by naming, we gain power over our world. By systematizing, we shape our surroundings.